Montana Wilderness, October 1932. While every homesteader within 50 miles of Billings was frantically reinforcing their timber frame houses and stockpiling coal for the brutal winter ahead, 16-year-old Thomas Brennan was hollowing out the side of a sandstone ridge with nothing but a pickaxe, a shovel, and what everyone called a fool's dream. The entrance measured 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, cut straight into the rust-colored stone that rose from the prairie like a frozen wave. Piles of excavated rock flanked the opening, sorted by size. Fist-sized chunks in one heap, gravel in another. Dust carefully collected in salvaged feed sacks. The interior tunnel extended 23 feet into the hillside, widening into a chamber that stood 12 feet across and 9 feet high at its dome. To anyone passing on the rutted dirt road below, it looked like a boy digging his own tomb. Brennan's lost his mind completely, Arnold Hutchins announced at the Sunday church social, loud enough for half the congregation to hear. Hutchins owned the lumber mill and 3 rental properties in town, and considered himself the authority on proper construction. Building a cave like some kind of animal, mark my words, he'll freeze solid in there come January, and will find his body in the spring thaw. But Thomas had no intention of freezing. He had spent 3 years learning from his grandfather, stands against wind, before the old man died of pneumonia in the harsh winter of 1929, and his grandfather had taught him that fighting the Montana cold with timber and nails and coal furnaces was like trying to hold back the wind with your bare hands. The earth itself, his grandfather had said, was the only shelter that never failed. Before we continue with Thomas's remarkable story, I want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story of a teenager who survived Montana's deadliest winter by building shelter inside the earth itself, hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. Your support helps us bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Now, let's get back to Thomas's story. The happy years felt like they belonged to someone else's life. Thomas remembered summer evenings when he was 11, sitting outside his grandfather's cabin while the old man worked leather into moccasins, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. Stands Against Wind was northern Cheyenne, though he'd been forced onto the reservation as a boy and had eventually drifted to the edges of white settlement, taking odd jobs and living quietly on land nobody else wanted. Thomas's mother, the old man's daughter, had married an Irish railroad worker named Patrick Brennan, and they'd built a small life on 40 acres of marginal land east of Billings. The white man's houses fight winter, his grandfather had told him the summer, pausing in his work to gesture at the horizon where a neighbor's frame house stood stark against the sky. They build thin walls and fill them with fire, burning fuel every day just to stay warm. The earth holds warmth like a buffalo's body holds heat. Work with the earth, not against it. Thomas's parents had listened politely, but never took the advice seriously. They'd built their house like everyone else, pine boards, tar paper, a coal stove in the center room. In March of 1930, diphtheria swept through the scattered homesteads. Thomas watched his mother die on a Monday, struggling for breath, her throat closed to the size of a straw. His father followed on Wednesday, his face gray and slack. Thomas was 13 years old. He buried them both in the hard spring ground, their graves marked with stones he carried from the ridge. The county placed him with his mother's cousin, Marcus Webb, who owned a decent spread 10 miles west, and who took Thomas in with the enthusiasm of a man accepting a stray dog. Webb's wife had died years before, and he ran his household with rigid efficiency. Thomas was given a straw mattress in the unheated loft, meals of boiled potatoes and occasional salt pork, and a list of chores that began before dawn and ended after dark. But Webb's farm gave Thomas something valuable, a front row seat to watch conventional methods fail. The winter of 1930-31 was brutal. Webb burned through 3 cords of firewood and 2 tons of coal trying to keep his timber frame house warm. The interior walls grew frost an inch thick every night. Webb's hands cracked and bled from the dry cold. The livestock huddled in a barn that leaked heat like a sieve. And by spring, Webb had lost 8 head of cattle to the cold, despite feeding them hay twice daily and keeping a fire burning in a barrel near their stalls. Thomas watched and remembered his grandfather's words. In the spring of 1931, Stands Against Wind died. Thomas found him in the old cabin, curled on his sleeping platform, his face peaceful. The pneumonia had taken him in his sleep. Thomas buried him on the ridge above the cabin, marking the grave with river stones arranged in a circle. He was 14 years old, and the last person who had loved him was gone. He found his grandfather's journals that day, 3 leather-bound books filled with sketches and notes in a mixture of English and Cheyenne. Drawings of earth lodges, explanations of thermal mass, diagrams showing how the Cheyenne had survived on the plains for generations, before timber houses and coal stoves. Thomas took the journals, a blanket, his grandfather's hunting knife, a hatchet, a tin cup, a change of clothes, and $37 he'd saved from odd jobs. He left before Marcus Webb woke up. The ridge his grandfather had loved sat 5 miles from Webb's farm, on land so poor nobody had bothered to file a claim. The soil was thin and rocky, useless for farming. No timber grew there, just scrub brush and short grass. A seasonal creek ran along the base in spring, but dried to scattered pools by summer. Every homesteader in the county had dismissed it as worthless. Thomas saw something different. The ridge faced south, catching full sun from dawn to dusk. The sandstone was soft enough to work, but stable enough to hold its shape. He'd seen his grandfather test it years ago, digging a small cavity to show how the stone fractured in layers. The ridge rose 40 feet above the surrounding prairie, high enough to avoid spring flooding, but low enough to be sheltered from the worst winds. And most importantly, the earth itself, 50 feet of solid rock and soil, would moderate temperature naturally, the way his grandfather had always said it would. Thomas filed a homestead claim at the land office. The clerk barely looked up. "That ridge? You're welcome to it, son. Nobody else wants it." If you want to find out how Thomas's underground shelter survived a deadly ice storm that killed 17 people across Montana, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Thomas Brennan built would shelter 16 neighbors through 5 days of record-breaking cold, save dozens of lives over the next 40 years, and change how an entire region thought about survival architecture. Thomas spent the first 2 weeks simply watching. He rose at dawn and sat on the ridge, tracking the sun's path. He noted how the wind moved, strongest from the northwest, gentler from the south. He observed where rainwater flowed during storms, marking the patterns with small rock cairns. He dug test holes at different elevations, checking soil depth and composition. He found the point where solid sandstone began, just 3 feet below the surface on the southern face of the ridge. Conventional homesteading wisdom said to build on flat ground near water, using timber for frame and boards for walls, with a coal or wood stove for heat. The problems with this approach were obvious to anyone who thought about it. Timber houses leaked air through 1,000 gaps. They required constant fuel to maintain warmth. They stood exposed to wind that sucked heat away faster than any stove could replace it. And they depended on a supply chain, coal from town, cut timber from mills, that could be disrupted by weather or money problems. Thomas's approach came from his grandfather's teachings. Instead of building on the earth, build in it. Instead of fighting cold with fire, use the earth's natural temperature stability. At depths below frost penetration, the ground maintains a relatively constant temperature year-round, approximately 45 to 55 degrees in Montana, cool in summer, warm compared to sub-zero winter air. By excavating into the ridge, Thomas would create shelter that required minimal heating, was protected from wind, and cost almost nothing to maintain. He began digging on May 15, 1931. The entrance location was critical, high enough to avoid water accumulation, positioned to face south for passive solar gain, protected from prevailing winds by the ridge's bulk. He marked an 8-foot-wide rectangle on the southern face, 4 feet above the base of the ridge where spring runoff would flow harmlessly below. The sandstone came away in layers. Thomas worked with the stone's natural fracture lines, using his pickaxe to split along bedding planes, then levering out chunks with a crowbar he'd bought with some of his precious dollars. It was slow, patient work. He could remove perhaps 6 cubic feet of stone on a good day, working from dawn until his hands refused to grip the tools. The stone was heavy. Each chunk weighed 10 to 40 pounds. He hauled it all outside, sorting constantly. Good flat pieces went in one pile for later use. Rubble went in another for fill. Dust and gravel he collected carefully. By the end of June, he'd penetrated 12 feet into the ridge. The tunnel was 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, high enough to walk upright, wide enough to work comfortably. The walls were rough but stable, showing no signs of cracking or slumping. The temperature inside, even on hot June days when outside air hit 90 degrees, remained a constant 52 degrees. Thomas kept notes, recording measurements with a thermometer he'd purchased at the general store. On the morning of July 3rd, Arnold Hutchins rode out to the ridge with 2 of his cronies from town. They found Thomas emerging from the tunnel, his shirt dark with sweat despite the cool interior temperature. "Well, look at this," Hutchins said, remaining mounted, looking down at Thomas like a judge regarding a criminal. "Brennan's really doing it, digging himself a hole like a prairie dog." His companions laughed. One of them, a man named Decker, who ran the hardware store, shook his head. "Boy, you know what lives in holes. Things that can't build proper shelter. Rats, snakes. You got Indian blood, everyone knows that, but this is just sad." Thomas straightened, setting his pickaxe down carefully. The interior temperature stays 52 degrees regardless of outside conditions. A timber frame house fluctuates by 40 to 60 degrees between day and night in summer, more in winter. This is more stable. Hutchins snorted. "Stable. You'll be stable all right. Stable frozen when winter comes. A man needs heat, boy. A proper stove, proper walls, proper insulation, not a hole in the ground." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice taking on the tone of a patient adult explaining reality to a dim child. "We've built houses the same way in Montana for 50 years because it works. My father built with timber, I build with timber, and anyone with sense does the same. You think you're smarter than generations of builders?" "I think there might be more than one way to solve the same problem," Thomas said quietly. "You think wrong," Hutchins replied. "Come December, when you're burning through firewood trying to keep that stone cave above freezing, you'll see why we do things the proper way, if you live that long." He wheeled his horse around. "Let's go. No point arguing with a fool." Thomas watched them ride away, then picked up his pickaxe and went back to work. By August, the main chamber was complete, a dome-shaped room 12 feet in diameter and 9 feet tall at the center. Thomas had spent 3 weeks carefully excavating the dome's shape, working from the center outward and upward, using the arch principle his grandfather had sketched in the journals. An arch distributes weight along its curve rather than straight down, making it far stronger than a flat ceiling of the same material. The sandstone held beautifully. Thomas smoothed the walls with sand and water, creating a surface that was rough but even. Now came the critical innovation. It was the heating system. In his journals, Stands Against Wind had drawn detailed diagrams of how the Mandan people heated their earth lodges. Instead of heating the air directly, which required constant fuel, they heated the structure itself, creating a thermal battery that radiated warmth for hours after the fire died. Thomas began with the floor. He excavated another 2 feet down across the entire chamber, removing nearly 30 cubic feet of stone and soil. Into this depression, he placed a layer of fist-sized rocks, the ones he'd been carefully sorting all summer. These rocks, gathered from the creek bed and the prairie, filled the pit to a depth of 18 inches. On top of this rock layer, he added 6 inches of gravel, then covered the entire surface with flat sandstone slabs he'd split specifically for this purpose. The result was a floor that sat flush with the tunnel entrance, composed of stone all the way down. The principle was simple thermal mass. Stone absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. The rock-filled floor represented roughly 12 tons of thermal mass. A small fire burning for 2 to 3 hours would warm this mass, which would then radiate heat back into the chamber for 8 to 12 hours. The system required far less fuel than a conventional stove trying to continuously heat air that escaped through walls and gaps. Thomas tested it on August 20th, as summer heat began to fade. He built a small fire in a circle of stones at the chamber's center, burning juniper wood he'd gathered from draws along the creek. The fire burned for 2 hours. When he let it die, the floor remained warm to the touch for the next 10 hours. Inside, temperature rose from 52 degrees to 68 degrees and fell back to 54 degrees over the course of a full day. Outside temperature that day ranged from 92 degrees to 54 degrees, a 38-degree swing. Inside the chamber, the total fluctuation was 16 degrees, and the entire cycle had consumed perhaps 7 pounds of wood. In town, heating a timber frame house through a cold night required 20 to 30 pounds of coal or 25 to 40 pounds of wood, burned continuously. And that was in moderate weather. Thomas kept detailed records, filling a notebook with temperature readings taken every 4 hours. The numbers didn't lie. The earth-sheltered chamber with thermal mass floor was 4 to 5 times more efficient than conventional construction. Through September and October, Thomas refined the shelter. He built a proper chimney system by excavating a narrow vertical shaft from the chamber's center up through the ridgetop. A 40-foot chimney carved through solid sandstone. The shaft measured 8 inches in diameter, wide enough for smoke but narrow enough to prevent heat loss. At the top, he built a cap from flat stones to prevent rain entry while allowing smoke to escape. The draw was excellent. Smoke rose efficiently, and outside air was pulled in through the entrance, creating gentle circulation. He built a door from salvaged lumber, simple but tight-fitting, hung on leather hinges he crafted himself. He gathered firewood methodically, stacking cords of juniper, pine, and cottonwood near the entrance. He hauled water from the creek in buckets, filling clay vessels he'd traded work for. He made trips to town for essentials, taking odd jobs, mucking stables, splitting wood, repairing tools, and earning enough to buy beans, flour, salt, a few blankets, some candles. People noticed his efficiency. The blacksmith hired him regularly because Thomas worked hard, never complained, and showed up exactly when he said he would. The money went entirely to practical needs. No tobacco, no candy, no luxuries. Just food, basic tools, materials. One afternoon in late October, Thomas was reinforcing the entrance when a rider approached. He tensed, expecting another mocking visit, but relaxed when he recognized Sarah Colton, daughter of a homesteader who lived 6 miles west. She was perhaps 18, her face weathered from outdoor work, her hands rough. She dismounted and approached cautiously. "Thomas Brennan?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. I heard you were building something unusual out here. My father said you were wasting your time, but—" She paused, looking at the entrance with genuine curiosity. "May I see?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. He lit a candle and led her inside. Sarah stopped just inside the chamber, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. "It's warm," she said, surprised. "Outside is 40 degrees, but in here—" 53 degrees, Thomas said. "Stays within a few degrees of that year-round. With a small fire, I can bring it to 65 or 70 and hold it there for hours." She walked slowly around the chamber, touching the walls, examining the floor. "How much fuel?" "A few pounds of wood every day or two, depending on outside temperature. A timber house burns 10 to 15 times that much." Sarah looked at him, and he saw not mockery, but respect in her expression. "That's actually clever," she said quietly. "My father burns through money trying to keep our house warm. We go through 2 tons of coal every winter, and the inside still freezes on the coldest nights." She touched the wall again. "This is solid, safe. It's how people survived for thousands of years before timber houses and coal stoves," Thomas said. "My grandfather taught me. I'm just applying principles that are older than Montana territory." Sarah nodded slowly. "People are going to feel foolish when they realize you're right." Thomas shrugged. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I just needed shelter." She left shortly after, but as she mounted her horse, she turned back. "Good luck this winter, Thomas. I hope it's mild." But her eyes said she didn't believe it would be, and for the first time since his grandfather's death, Thomas felt less alone. By November 1st, the shelter was complete. From the outside, it was barely visible, just an entrance set into the hillside, flanked by stacked firewood, with a thin stone chimney rising from the ridgetop 40 feet above. Inside, the chamber was simple but solid, the domed ceiling arched overhead, the stone walls smooth and dry, the floor level and warm. Thomas's possessions filled one corner, a sleeping platform built from poles and covered with blankets, a small table, a shelf holding food supplies, his grandfather's journals wrapped in oilcloth, a few cooking implements. His thermometer hung on the wall near the center. It read 54 degrees. Outside, November wind howled across the prairie at 35 miles per hour, and the temperature dropped to 18 degrees. Inside, The temperature was 54 degrees, the air still and comfortable, the walls radiating gentle warmth from a fire Thomas had burned 2 hours earlier using less than 5 pounds of wood. He settled in for winter, keeping his journal, reading by candlelight, venturing out only for firewood and water. The system worked exactly as his grandfather's teachings had promised. Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction. And on the first heavy snowfall in mid-November, he stood at the entrance watching fat flakes settle across the prairie and thought that his grandfather would have been proud. December brought cold. But not the killing cold. Temperatures dropped to 0, then 5 below, then 10 below. In town, people burned coal around the clock. Smoke hung heavy over Billings. At the ridge, Thomas used perhaps 8 pounds of wood per day, burning a small fire each evening that warmed the thermal mass floor and kept the chamber comfortable through the night. He recorded temperatures faithfully. Inside ranged from 58 to 64 degrees. Outside ranged from 5 above to 20 below. January 1933 began cold. By the second week, temperatures had dropped into the negative teens and stayed there. Then, on January 15th, the sky took on a peculiar yellow-gray color, and the wind shifted to blow directly from the north. The ice storm hit on January 16th at 2 in the morning. Temperature plummeted to 30 below zero. Freezing rain fell for 3 hours, coating everything in thick ice. Then the real cold came behind it. By dawn, the temperature was 35 below zero. By noon, it had dropped to 37 below. In town and across the scattered homesteads, people burned everything they could: coal, wood, furniture, books. Houses couldn't hold heat against that kind of cold. Inside walls frosted over completely. Water froze solid in buckets kept near stoves. Livestock died in their barns. The oldest and weakest people, 3 elderly folks in town, 2 homesteader children, a sick woman 12 miles east, died in their beds despite fires burning in their stoves. Arnold Hutchins' fine timber house, insulated and well-built, dropped to 20 degrees inside despite burning coal continuously. His teenage son developed frostbite on his fingers just fetching coal from the shed. Hutchins himself suffered a burned hand when he stumbled against the glowing stove in the middle of the night, desperate to add more fuel. The storm lasted 5 days. The temperature didn't rise above 25 below the entire time. 17 people across the county died. Exposure, hypothermia, accidents in the desperate cold. Dozens more suffered frostbite, burns, illness. It was the worst cold snap Montana had seen in 40 years. On the 3rd day of the storm, Sarah Colton wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she owned and set out from her family's homestead. The journey to Thomas's Ridge was only 6 miles, but in that cold, it felt like 60. Her father had sent her. Their house was holding at 15 degrees inside, despite burning through their entire month's coal supply in 3 days, and her mother was showing signs of hypothermia. Her father thought Thomas was probably dead in his cave, but on the slim chance he'd somehow survived, maybe he could offer some knowledge, some trick they'd missed. Sarah's face was wrapped in wool scarves until only her eyes showed. Ice formed on the fabric from her breath. Her hands and feet went numb after the first mile. She kept moving because stopping meant dying. The wind drove through her layers like knives. The landscape was unrecognizable, buried under ice and snow, and she navigated by memory and desperation. When she finally saw the ridge rising from the white prairie, she expected to find the entrance sealed with ice. No smoke from the chimney, silence. Instead, she saw a thin wisp of smoke rising from the stone chimney cap 40 feet above, and as she approached, stumbling through drifts, she realized the entrance was clear, swept clean, and a faint warmth seemed to radiate from the opening. She reached the door and pounded on it weakly, her frozen hands barely able to make noise. The door opened. Thomas stood there in a wool shirt and canvas pants, no coat, looking concerned. "Sarah, come inside, quickly." She stumbled through the entrance, and the sensation that hit her was so overwhelming she stopped in her tracks and nearly wept. Warmth. Real, genuine, comfortable warmth that soaked into her frozen body like sunlight after endless darkness. The chamber glowed with candlelight. The walls radiated heat. The floor beneath her feet was warm even through her frozen boots. The air was calm, still, comfortable. "What temperature is it?" she asked, her voice cracking. Thomas glanced at the thermometer on the wall. 62 degrees right now. It's been between 60 and 65 for the last 3 days. Sarah stared at him. "It's 37 below outside. Our house is 15 degrees inside, and we've been burning coal non-stop for 3 days. Her voice rose. "How much are you burning?" "I burned 1 fire yesterday evening, about 6 pounds of wood. Another this morning, maybe 5 pounds. The thermal mass in the floor holds the heat. And the earth insulates naturally. The temperature 50 feet away from the entrance, deeper in the ridge, is around 48 degrees year-round. The chamber benefits from that stable temperature." He gestured to the walls. "Touch it. Feel for yourself." Sarah pulled off her frozen mittens and placed her bare hand against the stone wall. It was solid, slightly warm, radiating gentle, steady heat. Not the fierce burn of a stove surface, but the comfortable warmth of sunlight on stone. She felt her entire understanding of shelter shift. "The earth holds warmth," Thomas said quietly, and she heard his grandfather's voice in those words. "You can't fight cold with just fire. You have to work with what's already stable. The ground doesn't care if the air is 30 below. 50 feet down, it stays the same temperature it was in July." Sarah stood there, hand on the warm wall, tears freezing on her face as they fell. "People are dying," she whispered. "My mother is turning blue. My father's house is better built than most, and we can't keep it warm." "How many people are at your house?" 5, my parents, 2 brothers, my sister." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 6 miles? "Yes." "Could your father bring everyone here if I sent you back with instructions? The chamber isn't large, but 16 people could shelter here safely. The thermal mass would need more fuel, but I have enough wood, and 6 miles is survivable if you know it's worth the journey." Sarah looked around the chamber, 12 feet across, 9 feet tall, crowded but warm, alive instead of dead. "He'll come," she said. "If I tell him what I've seen, he'll come. They'll all come." Word spread through desperation. Sarah made it home, told her father, and that evening, 7 people made the brutal journey to the ridge, the Colton family. Arnold Hutchins and his son, a widow from 2 miles east. They arrived half-frozen, skeptical, desperate. They entered the chamber and stopped, feeling warmth soak into their bodies, seeing the calm certainty in Thomas's eyes and the thermometer reading on the wall showing 64 degrees. "How?" Hutchins asked, and there was no mockery in his voice anymore, just exhaustion and confusion. Thomas showed them the floor, explained thermal mass, pointed to the earth walls that provided insulation no timber frame could match. He showed them his fuel supply, plenty of wood, carefully stacked. He showed them his records, 3 months of temperature data proving the system's efficiency. Hutchins stared at the numbers, then at Thomas. "I called you a fool," he said quietly. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. "You thought I was wrong," Thomas replied. "Most people did. Can you teach this? Can others build?" He gestured around. "This?" "Yes." That night, 11 people slept in Thomas's chamber. It was crowded but comfortable. Thomas burned 2 fires, using perhaps 15 pounds of wood total, and the interior temperature held between 61 and 65 degrees, while outside the mercury dropped to 40 below. In the morning, everyone was alive, warm, rested. Several cried quietly, overwhelmed by relief. Over the next 3 days, word spread further. 19 more people made the journey, seeking shelter. Thomas accommodated them all, organizing shifts, managing fuel carefully, teaching principles. The chamber became a refuge. People who had mocked him weeks earlier now sat in his shelter, warm and alive, watching him move calmly through the space, tending the fire, checking temperatures, patient and competent. On the 5th day, the cold broke. Temperature rose to 10 below, then 0, then 5 above. People began returning to their homes to assess damage and salvage what they could. Before they left, many asked Thomas to visit, to advise, to teach. Hutchins himself, standing at the entrance before departing, said, "I'll send people. Anyone who asks about building different, I'll send them to you." It wasn't quite gratitude, but it was respect. And Thomas nodded acceptance. Over the next year, Thomas helped build 7 more earth-sheltered structures across the county. He taught the principles freely: site selection, excavation techniques, thermal mass floors, proper ventilation. He never charged for consultation, though people often paid him anyway in food, materials, or tools. By 1935, 23 earth-sheltered homes had been built using his methods, scattered across Montana, from Billings to Miles City to Great Falls. The technique spread through word of mouth, farmer to farmer, builder to builder. In 1937, a professor from Montana State College came to interview Thomas, now 22 years old, and document his methods. The resulting paper, published in an obscure engineering journal, described the thermal efficiency of earth-sheltered construction and credited traditional Northern Cheyenne techniques preserved by oral tradition and adapted by Thomas Brennan. The paper circulated among architects and engineers interested in sustainable building, though mainstream construction remained committed to conventional approaches. Thomas never sought recognition. He lived quietly in his chamber, which he gradually expanded and refined over the years. He married Sarah Colton in 1938, and they raised 2 children in the earth-sheltered home, eventually excavating additional chambers for privacy and comfort. He continued consulting on earth-sheltered construction, helping build more than 40 structures over the next 3 decades. His reputation was quiet but solid. People knew that Thomas Brennan's buildings worked, that they saved fuel, that they kept families safe in weather that killed others. He kept his grandfather's journals his entire life, wrapped carefully and stored in a dry alcove he'd carved specifically for them. He taught his children and grandchildren the principles Stands Against Wind had taught him. He never claimed to have invented anything. "I'm just remembering what was forgotten," he'd say when people called him innovative. Thomas's dog, a mixed breed named Scout that he'd found as a stray pup in 1934, lived 15 years and died peacefully in 1949. Thomas buried Scout on the ridge above the entrance, marking the grave with a flat stone that read simply, "Scout, good dog, loyal friend." Thomas himself died in 1971 at age 56, his heart giving out suddenly while he was working in the garden Sarah had planted on the ridgetop decades earlier. By then, his techniques had saved countless lives and thousands of dollars in fuel costs. The original chamber, expanded and modernized but still fundamentally the same, had sheltered his family for 40 years. His funeral drew 300 people. They came from across Montana and Wyoming, families he'd helped, students he'd taught, engineers who'd studied his work. His grandson, Peter Brennan, gave the eulogy standing at the chamber entrance. "My grandfather was called crazy," Peter said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "He was called a fool for building a hole in the ground when he should have built a proper house. He was mocked, dismissed, told he'd die." Peter paused, emotion thick in his voice. But he didn't die. Other people died in the ice storm of 1933. 17 people froze in conventional houses. My grandfather stayed warm in his cave with minimal fuel, and when people came to him desperate and frozen, he sheltered them. 16 people survived 5 days of record cold because he had the courage to remember what his grandfather taught him and the patience to build it right. Peter looked at the stone ridge rising behind him. "Rest now, grandfather. Stands Against Wind is waiting, and the chambers will hold." Today, the original structure still stands, modernized with electric lighting and some interior finishing. But the basic chamber remains exactly as Thomas built it in 1931-1932. The site has been designated a historical landmark. Visitors come to see it, walking through the entrance Thomas carved by hand, standing in the chamber where he sheltered neighbors during Montana's deadliest winter. The temperature inside, year-round, holds steady between 52 and 58 degrees, exactly as Thomas's records from 90 years ago documented. 3 memorial markers sit on the ridge above the entrance. One for Stands Against Wind, Northern Cheyenne Elder, Teacher of Old Ways, 1851-1931. One for Thomas Brennan, Builder, Rememberer, 1916 and 1971. One for Scout, Faithful Companion, Guardian of the Ridge. The ice storm of January 1933 tested an assumption that had gone unchallenged, that the way things had always been done was the way they should continue. Thomas Brennan proved that wrong, not with theory, but with a thermometer and careful records. And the simple fact of his survival. The principles he used were ancient, developed by indigenous peoples over thousands of years. The Mandan-built earth lodges on the northern plains that maintain comfortable temperatures through brutal winters. The ancestral Puebloans carved cliff dwellings into canyon walls in the southwest, staying cool in summer and warm in winter. The traditional homes of northern China and Tunisia used earth berming and thermal mass for climate control centuries before modern engineering. These weren't primitive shelters. They were sophisticated applications of thermal dynamics and site-specific design that modern science has confirmed work exactly as traditional knowledge claimed. Modern engineering now recognizes what stands against wind knew intuitively. Earth provides thermal mass and insulation properties that far exceed conventional above-ground construction. The ground temperature at depths below 6 feet remains stable year-round, typically within 10 to 15 degrees of the region's annual average temperature. Earth-sheltered structures require 60 to 80% less heating and cooling energy than equivalent above-ground buildings. These aren't controversial claims. They're documented, measured, proven. Thomas succeeded because he was willing to question conventional wisdom. He had nothing, no money, no tools, no family support. But he had observation, patience, and willingness to learn from tradition that others dismissed as obsolete. What the lumber companies and coal suppliers built quickly and profitably crumbled within decades. What a 16-year-old orphan built slowly and carefully still stands, still functions, still demonstrates principles that mainstream construction is only now beginning to relearn. There's a metaphor here about extraction versus stewardship, about knowledge shared freely versus expertise hoarded for profit, about taking from the earth versus working with it. Thomas Brennan never became famous, never wrote books, never sought patents or recognition. He simply lived, raised his family, helped his neighbors, and taught freely when asked. The 43 earth-sheltered structures he helped build sheltered hundreds of people through 8 decades of Montana weather, providing comfort and safety when conventional systems failed or became too expensive to maintain. Most are gone now, replaced or abandoned as families moved and times changed. But the knowledge survives, preserved in academic papers, in family stories, in the few remaining structures that still function exactly as designed. So, here's the question for you. What abandoned idea exists in your thinking? What dismissed approach has everyone written off as old-fashioned or impractical? What might happen if you looked at it the way Thomas looked at that worthless ridge? Not as a dead end, but as a beginning. If this story resonated, if it made you think differently about survival, innovation, or questioning assumptions, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment about what spoke to you, and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things through patience, observation, and courage. Because sometimes the best shelter isn't the one everyone else is building. Sometimes it's the one you carve from the earth with your own 2 hands and the wisdom of those who came before.